The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Welcome to our 8th topic in this course, in which we introduce you to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This discussion of the model is unique, in that it will provide you with a step-by-step process to apply this framework to real data. Why is this important? Most textbook discussions of this macroeconomic framework muddle the time element for change, blur the static and dynamic aspects of the model, only qualitatively discuss the picture, when there are quantitative points to be made for better clarity, and fail to distinguish ex ante and ex post elements of the model. I believe that if you can use actual economic data to visualize the state of the economy, along with estimates of the theoretical concepts, then you will better understand the broader macroeconomic ideas of gap analysis, recession, inflation, interest rates all come together more coherently. However, I would be remiss if I did not mention that this paradigm has been embraced in the academic world, as well as rejected or attempted to modify it, sometimes inappropriately. Despite the controversy over the years, the consensus of the academic world accepts it as a useful conceptual framework. To paraphrase a widely held sentiment in economics, that was stated in a 1988 article by Princeton University economist Ben Bernanke, who would later become a Federal Reserve Board chair, and Alan Blinder, who later was a Federal Reserve Board vice chair, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, which is a foundational paradigm for macroeconomics, is not interpreted literally, nor does anyone think it is directly suitable for econometric estimation, but it is useful for telling simple, yet coherent stories about the transmission of monetary, fiscal, and other shocks through the economy. Please read Chapter 8 in the textbook. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model packages the key data and economic goals that we discussed previously into a framework that is what is called gap analysis. The gap concept, in this model, is between actual activity relative to its goal. In this topic, you will learn about 1. The history of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply idea, and its relationship with the concept of potential output. 2. How the model is constructed, and how you might apply that model to different economic periods. 3. What takeaways about recession and inflation could be gleaned from applying the model. 4. What the limitations of the model are. Okay, let's begin. The starting point is to ask, what is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model? The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model portrays the economic relationship between the average price level in the economy, that is not individual prices and not inflation, and output, accounting for both short-run actual and potential output. Throughout this discussion, we will often use the shorthand of AD for aggregate demand and AS for aggregate supply. Who invented the concept? Although John Maynard Keynes wrote about aggregate demand and aggregate supply in his 1936 General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, Keynes did not develop the AD and AS model paradigm. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model was first introduced in 1948 by Kenneth Boulding in his textbook Economic Analysis. However, 2 years later in 1950, Brownlee was credited as the first person to present a published version of the model, without reference to the foundational work by the late British economist Sir John Hicks, who won the 1972 Nobel Prize for Economics, and has been described as one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. Hicks' foundational model, known as the IS and LM model, related the investment and savings equilibrium to the supply and demand for money, and depicted Keynes's conclusion that an economy can be in equilibrium at less than full employment. Moreover, certainly for more than 50 years the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model has been the standard paradigm used to introduce students to macroeconomics. This AD and AS paradigm evolved from its original formulation, with the incorporation of Arthur Oken's concept of potential output in the 1960s, and today's version is known as a gap model. This modification then distinguishes two forms of supply: short-run aggregate supply, denoted as SRAS, and long-run aggregate supply, denoted as LRAS, where all factors of production are assumed variable, and the economy is at full resource use. The model is used to tell stories about the economic cycles of recession and expansion, including slowdowns and boom periods, inflation, both demand pull and cost push, and policies to address economic maladies. Keep in mind, however, the paradigm does not advocate or lead to any single policy recommendation. Quite the contrary, policy options solely depend on the economic stories that are told around the picture. Additionally, this framework becomes increasingly globally operational, with the World Bank's estimates of potential output for 159 developing countries, using its production function concept, and with the global rise of independent financial councils that are estimating potential output for their respective countries, such as the U.S. Congressional Budget Office or the U.K. Office of Budget Responsibility. As a result, this medium to long-term concept of potential, or sustainable level of output, also is used to judge the country's path of its public sector spending and debt, making potential output increasingly embedded in fiscal policy decisions. What economic data are used and displayed in the AD and AS model? The model uses 1. Inflation-adjusted or real GDP, which is conceptually equal to inflation-adjusted or real gross domestic income. 2. GDP price index, and 3. Inflation-adjusted or real potential GDP. Do you remember our earlier discussion of the differences between GDP and GDI? We discussed real gross domestic product as aggregate demand, because it was the sum of final demand by sectors of the economy. Additionally, we discussed that real gross domestic income was conceptually aggregate supply, because it tallied the payments to the factors of production. However, in the final tally real GDP equals real GDI. The concept of real potential GDP, we have seen as a sustainable goal for output of the economy. That measure we discussed is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. Now, let's dig deeper into some of these concepts that are used in the model. What is the definition of real potential GDP? Real or inflation-adjusted potential GDP, which also is known as the natural real GDP or full employment real GDP, measures trend or sustainable economic output from the supply-side factors, that is, demographics, labor, capital, and technology, without the boom-bust effects from the business cycle, where inflation is steady, and the economy is operating at full employment. This estimated concept of real potential GDP is the long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS. Also, note that the growth of real potential GDP is the sum of the growth of the potential labor force and growth of potential labor force productivity. The potential labor force is the CBO's estimate of the size of the labor force that would occur if economic output and other key variables were at their maximum sustainable amounts. Potential labor force productivity is the ratio of real potential GDP to the potential labor force. How is the model structured? The AD and AS model is based on three component parts. 1. Aggregate demand, which is defined as real GDP, and represents aggregate expenditures, that is, the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This is the buying side of the economy. 2. Short-run aggregate supply or SRAS, which is defined as real gross domestic income, or GDI, and represents the payments to the factors of production, that is, wages, rent, interest payments, etc. This is an upward sloping curve representing a positive relationship, that is, moves in same direction between the price level and output. This is the producing side of the economy. 3. Long-run aggregate supply or LRAS, which is defined as real potential gross domestic product, is based on estimates from the Congressional Budget Office. LRAS is the same as potential real GDP, and may be thought of as trend growth. This is the goal for the economy. The three components are shown on this slide. From the upper left is the aggregate demand curve, which is a downward sloping curve. Below that graphic is the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is an upward sloping curve. Finally, on the right is the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is portrayed as a vertical line at potential output. Simple enough? There are three parts to the model: a measure of demand, and two measures of supply, one for the short run, and one for the long term, which also serves as the goal. What is the time period for the AD and AS model? The model is a static picture, that is, a snapshot of the economy at a point in time. There is no dynamic here, just a status check, so to speak. However, there is assumed an adjustment process between aggregate demand and supply, within a given time period, to produce an equilibrium. The adjustment to yield that equilibrium between aggregate demand and supply is assumed to occur in the very short run. More specifically, the late Sir John Hicks observed that the length of the period that Keynes had in mind was a short period for the aggregate demand and aggregate supply adjustment, which Keynes thought could be a year. But Hicks felt it was better to think in terms of an ultra-short period. Maybe akin to a week, he says, when factors of production are fixed in a period short enough to avoid lots of things changing, and that markets could reflect propensities and expectations as they are at a moment in time. For better or worse, given the quarterly GDP statistics, this by definition suggests that the measured period of adjustment to reach an equilibrium occurs within the 3 months of each quarter. What data points are captured in the model? Be careful here. The question is about the points along the curves that make up the model, and not the curves themselves. Hence, the answer to this question is: the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply implicitly distinguishes between 1. Ex post and ex ante aggregate demand, 2. Ex post and ex ante short-run aggregate supply, and 3. Ex post and ex ante real GDP as aggregate demand, and real GDI as short-run aggregate supply. Probably the best explanation of the time horizon and distinction between ex ante and ex post, or actual, points along the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curves was given by Sir John Hicks, who crafted the IS and LM model that formed the basis for the AD and AS model. Hicks' view was that, quote, "It is only the point of intersection of the curves which makes any claim to representing what actually happened. Other points on either of the curves surely do not make no claim to represent, what actually happened. They are theoretical constructions, which are supposed to indicate what would have happened, if the rate of interest had been different." Unquote. Wow, what do we mean by ex post and ex ante? Let's distinguish between those terms as we use them here. First, by definition, the Latin phrase ex ante simply means before the event, and ex post means after the event. Another way to conceptualize this is that ex ante represents what might be, but ex post represents what happened. Remember also that we previously noted that real GDP and real GDI are measured after all market transactions have been executed, all goods and services have been produced, delivered, consumed, or invested. As such, ex post, real GDP and real GDI are equal after all the transactions occur for a given period, which is foundational to the national income accounting. As a historical note, the concepts of ex ante and ex post are claimed to be the most popular terminological innovations developed by the famous so-called Stockholm School of Economics in the 1930s. Let's drive home this distinction between ex post and ex ante. Ex ante aggregate demand is planned and decided by all final demand users. Ex ante aggregate supply is planned and decided by all producers. Ex post GDP equals ex post gross domestic income, which is a bookkeeping concept. Real GDP measures expenditures. That is, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, and represents aggregate demand. Real GDI measures payments for the factors of production. That is, wages, profits, rental income, and interest payments, and represents short-run aggregate supply. Then, aggregate demand equals real GDP, which equals real GDI, which equals aggregate supply, or really short-run aggregate supply. This last relationship was discussed in Chapter 2 when we introduced the circular flow concept in national income accounting. If the terms ex ante and ex post are still not intuitive, just substitute the word planned for ex ante, and the word actual for ex post. Therefore, it should be clear that planned aggregate demand will not necessarily equal planned short-run, or even long-run, aggregate supply. The ex post market equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply is determined by adjustments in prices, wages, interest rates, employment, and so forth, which are, in essence, a behind-the-scene adjustment in the model, bringing about the equilibrium. What are the component factors and the causal factors affecting AD and SRAS? This is an important distinction to make between components of the model and its causal factors. Students often mix up the two. The component factors are the accounting relationships, but the causal factors are the stories that move demand and supply. This table portrays those components and causal factors for both aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. Aggregate demand defined as real GDP is the sum of its components, that is, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Aggregate supply defined as real GDI is the sum of its components, a bit more technically defined, but largely labor compensation, rental income, interest income, and profits. These definitions speak to the components of the aggregates, which are assumed to capture the underlying changes in aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. However, those are just the components of the aggregates, and not the causal factors changing AD and SRAS. The causal factors are key to shifting AD and SRAS through their respective components. Moreover, Sir John Hicks said of this construct, quote, "The only way in which this analysis usefully survives, other than as a classroom gadget, is to incorporate causal analysis." Unquote. Indeed, those causal impacts are built into the stories told with the model. What determines the shape of the aggregate demand curve? The theoretical reasons given for a downward sloping AD curve are: 1. Wealth effect, also known as the real balances effect and the Pigou effect. This effect suggests that if the price level is higher, then you can afford less. Everything else held constant. The reverse is true as well, and this wealth effect leads to an inverse relationship between the price level and aggregate demand. 2. Interest rate effect. This effect suggests that if interest rates rise, then investment, both residential and non-residential, will be lower. This works in reverse if interest rates decline. Again, all of these intermediate adjustments on aggregate demand playing out in the ex-ante stage, prior to the ex-post transactional settling of the price level and output for the period. 3. Exchange rate effect. This effect suggests a stronger domestic currency, such as the US dollar, will increase the demand for imports, since the domestic currency is cheaper relative to the foreign country, which is producing the goods and services that will be imported. In turn, this will weaken foreign demand for the domestic economy's exports, because they cost more to the foreigners. This too works the other way, for a depreciation in the domestic currency. Keep in mind, unlike the microeconomics counterpart to the aggregate demand curve, the price level for the aggregate demand curve is viewed as a reaction to some change, not the catalyst for that change. Also, the price level is not inflation in this model. Let's run down how each of these reasons suggest a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. The wealth effect suggests that if the price level increases, because of some causal factor pushing it up, then the real value of financial wealth declines, since real financial wealth equals nominal financial wealth divided by the price level, which in turn causes the amount of output demanded to decline, because there is less real wealth to pay the goods and services. The reverse is true for a price decline, which will hold for each of these reasons for a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. But we will not repeat that note each time. The interest rate effect suggests that if the price level increases, because of some causal factor pushing it up, then the interest rate increases, which in turn causes the output demanded to decline, because people will borrow less money to purchase those goods and services. The exchange rate effect suggests that if the domestic price level increases, then the relative price of foreign products will decline because of a stronger foreign exchange rate for the country's currency, which in turn will cause more purchasing of the foreign products, and less of the domestically produced goods and services. These are the stories that are told for a downward sloping demand curve. Despite these theoretical arguments for the downward shaped curve, some notable economists have argued aggregate demand may be upward or downward sloping. We will not go into those details, but it should be a warning that there is a different rationale offered for a mostly downward sloping aggregate demand curve than for the microeconomics concept of a demand curve. I largely accept the idea of a downward sloping aggregate demand curve because some very limited empirical studies showed a negative relationship in the price elasticity of aggregate demand and, for that matter, a positive price elasticity of short-run aggregate supply, supporting an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Additionally, my own simple data analysis found a negative relationship in the price elasticity of U.S. aggregate demand, and a positive relationship for U.S. short-run aggregate supply, as theory would suggest, but only under certain conditions between 1950 and 2023. Nevertheless, it is difficult to tease out some of these empirical findings from the data because planned actions are unobservable. Now, we ask, what determines the shape of the short-run aggregate supply curve? The key theoretical reasons offered by economists for the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve are: 1. Profit motivation. A higher price level that would encourage higher output, because producers would hope to gain higher profits and vice versa. 2. Cost motivation. The primary cause of short-run aggregate supply is a change in input prices, which affects profits and may be affected by productivity and economic growth. Hence, higher input prices pair profit margins, profits, and output, and vice versa. 3. Sticky prices and wages. Prices and wages are slow to adjust to changes in economic conditions. 4. Worker misperceptions. Workers are slow to adjust to labor market conditions. So, when there is a change in aggregate demand that results in a change in the price level facing suppliers, this, in turn, triggers a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve. If that change is a higher price level due to the change in demand, then the short-run aggregate supply response is to produce more goods and services, as the real production costs of labor, that is, real wages, which are nominal wages divided by the price level, or real materials prices decrease, then this causes producers to hire more workers or expand hours worked, to produce a larger quantity of goods and services, which in turn would increase their profits. However, if that change is a lower price level due to the change in demand, then the sequences we just described will be in the reverse direction. Therefore, in essence, a demand-caused increase in the price level, for whatever causal reason, will trigger a lower real cost of production for the goods and services, which causes greater output, and vice versa. This is a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve. Alternatively, factor costs can cause aggregate supply to change without a change in aggregate demand, or, initially, the price level. A jump in the price of diesel fuel used in trucking fleets is an example. Or, a legislated minimum wage increase is another example. So, when there is a change in a factor cost of production, without a change in aggregate demand and the price level, that will cause an upward shift in the producer's output prices, while economy's overall price level is unchanged, which will cause higher real wages or real production costs, generally, which will cause a reduction in output. The reverse is true, as well. This is a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. In the explanation of sticky prices and wages, and worker misperceptions, those supply responses may be only initially the response before a catch-up later. Again, these are the stories that are told for an upward-sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. We will see shortly that the empirical findings, though limited, for these ideas, which we will use to develop an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. How can those unobserved, ex-ante AD points in the model be estimated? Do you remember our initial discussion about elasticity as a prerequisite topic to macroeconomics? Well, one of those topics was on elasticity, which can be used to answer this question. Planned aggregate demand points might be estimated based on theory and/or empirical studies. 1. It has been argued by the neoclassical school of economic thought that aggregate demand is unit elastic. That is, -1.00, which means a 1% change in aggregate price is matched by a 1% change in aggregate demand, in the opposite direction to the price change, or for any like percentage amount, with respect to the aggregate price level. 2. The Keynesian school of economic thought would argue that the aggregate demand price elasticity is more variable than the neoclassical perspective, based on where the economy is along the aggregate demand curve. 3. One estimate of the price elasticity of aggregate demand is -0.90, measured for the U.S. economy between 2001 and 2020. Ahead, we will use that result for the price elasticity of aggregate demand to develop an empirical aggregate demand curve. Let's review the elasticity concept. How can those unobserved ex-ante AD points in the model be estimated? If we use the price elasticity of aggregate demand of -0.90, and assume it is a constant elasticity throughout the curve, which is termed an isoelasticity of demand, then that tells us that for every 1% change in the aggregate price, aggregate demand will show a -0.9% change. To refresh your memory, the elasticity formula is shown on this slide. So, in this case, if we know the aggregate price elasticity of aggregate demand is -0.90, then to use that finding we need to know something about the percentage change in aggregate demand, which is real GDP, and percentage change in the aggregate price, which is the GDP price index. This slide shows the formula for elasticity with the interpretation of inelastic and elastic. The more inelastic aggregate demand is, the less responsive it is to changes in aggregate price. And price elasticity of aggregate demand below -1.00 is considered inelastic, and the lower the number the greater the inelasticity. We will use these concepts shortly. Let's look at the short-run aggregate supply curve now. How can those unobserved ex-ante SRAS points in the model be estimated? The planned or ex-ante SRAS points also might be estimated based on theory and/or empirical studies. 1. It also has been argued that the price elasticity of aggregate supply is fairly elastic in the short run. But the price elasticity of supply is fairly inelastic. That is a relatively steep or vertical line in the long run. 2. This short-term and long-term combined view is stylistically described as a lazy L, or an L-shaped curve on its backside. Why is price elasticity of aggregate demand important? If the price elasticity of aggregate demand is elastic, that is an elasticity of more than 1 in absolute value. That means a price impact will have a greater aggregate demand impact. If the price elasticity of aggregate demand, that is elasticity of less than 1 in absolute value, is inelastic, that means a price impact will have a larger inflation impact than an aggregate demand impact. Why is the price elasticity of aggregate supply important? If the price elasticity of short-run aggregate supply is elastic, that is elasticity of more than 1, that means a price impact will have a greater aggregate supply impact. If the price elasticity of short-run aggregate supply, that is elasticity of less than 1, is inelastic, that means a price impact will have a larger inflation impact than an aggregate supply impact. Now, we are starting to see that the elasticity of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply have implications for inflation. How can those unobserved, ex-ante short-run aggregate supply points in the model be estimated? The planned or ex-ante SRAS points might be estimated based on theory and/or empirical studies. 1. The empirical findings suggest the elasticity of short-run aggregate supply is closer to the neoclassical school view, rather than the stylized L-shaped Keynesian SRAS. 2. An estimate of the price elasticity of short-run aggregate supply between 2010 and 2018 was 1.48, meaning it is elastic. But a long-run estimate between 1960 and 2018 was less than 1, meaning it is inelastic. But not exactly 1.00 as hypothesized. However, we will go with the theory when using this result for the derivation of the AD and AS model. How can we use those price elasticity estimates to develop additional points along the AD or the SRAS curves? Now, we are getting to the nitty-gritty of using these elasticity estimates to develop the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. To use those estimates, we need to have at least 2 pairs of price and output coordinates to construct the AD and SRAS curves. And we already have the actual data as 1 pair of coordinates for each curve. Using the aggregate price elasticity of aggregate demand, one can find another point along the AD curve. Using the aggregate price elasticity of short-run aggregate supply, one can find another point along the SRAS curve. Okay, so let's gather the data to develop an aggregate demand curve. Step 1. Assemble the data for ex-post real GDP, and the actual or ex-post GDP price level for the period of analysis. For this example, let's assume we are interested in the third quarter of 2023. From the data in the table, we see that the level of real GDP in that period was $22,490.7 billion. This is one piece of the information that we need to use in order to develop the graphical model. Next, let's get the implicit price deflator for GDP for that same period. We see from the table that the price deflator value was 122.762 in that period. This is the second piece of information that we need. The third piece of information is real potential GDP, which is estimated by the CBO to be $22,369.7 billion. Now, let's pull these data together. Step 2. Use the price elasticity of aggregate demand estimate, that is, minus 0.90, to generate ex-ante estimates of real GDP, based on an ex-ante GDP price level for the period of analysis. To do this, just assume that the price level changes by some percentage, to get a new price point, and to find the aggregate demand value or coordinate, use the elasticity formula where we know the elasticity is minus 0.90. Although we need only one extra point to develop that aggregate demand curve, we will generate 2 points. To do this, assume prices increase by 10% and also decrease by 10, although any growth rate change will do. So, the price level that is 10% higher than the ex-post or actual reading of 122.762 is 135.038, that is, 1.1 multiplied by 122.762. Similarly, the price level that is 10% lower than the ex-post or actual reading of 122.762 is 110.486, that is, 0.9 multiplied by 122.762. Okay, now that we have those two additional price points, we can use the elasticity measure to calculate an estimate of the ex-ante real GDP data, consistent with those price levels. To do that, when the price is 10% higher than the actual reading, the level of real GDP, which is aggregate demand, will be $20,466.5 billion. That is, minus 0.90, which is the price elasticity, multiplied by 10, which is the 10% higher price, or minus 9, divided by 100, to convert it to a decimal, plus 1, or 0.91. Then that 0.91 is multiplied by the actual real GDP data, that is, 0.91 times $22,490.7 billion, which yields $20,466.5 billion. For each element of the data set that we need to derive on the aggregate demand curve, it is best to view these calculations on the slide. A similar calculation is done for the price, which is 10% lower than the ex-post figure. This calculation is shown on the slide, also. Now that we have the coordinates for the aggregate demand curve, we will plot them. This is shown on this slide using Excel. It is very easy to do in Excel, but you can also do it by hand. The next step is to connect the points on the graphic, which yields the aggregate demand curve for that period. As noted on this slide, be sure that when you do this exercise you properly label both axes. Now, it is your turn to determine the coordinates for the short-run aggregate supply curve, and then the long-run aggregate supply curve. The steps to do that are on this slide. Pause this video while you do that. Okay, hopefully you paused the video, and did that exercise before moving ahead. But if not, you now see the calculations for the other curves. Although the calculations for this model are relatively simple, the most important part of this exercise is the interpretation of the model. What can you say about the U.S. economy in the third quarter of 2023? What is the GDP or output gap? Take a moment and pause this video again to calculate that gap. What does that tell you? Once you have done that calculation, let's zoom in on this graphic with a more limited range for the price and output axes. The question this raises and is begging for an answer: was the economy experiencing excess demand? If so, what does that tell us about inflation? So, with this limited data, we can make some important observations about the economy. If you were a fiscal policymaker, what do you think the appropriate policy should be? If you were a monetary policymaker, what would you think the appropriate policy should be? Okay. We will continue to explore aspects of this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. But hopefully, you see that this model, as simple as it is, begins to connect parts of the economy with policy implications. What happens when aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are initially not in equilibrium? Although we cannot see this from the data, in that ultra-short run period that Sir John Hicks wrote about, there is an adjustment process between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, in search of an equilibrium, given causal factors that could produce that result. The off-equilibrium values associated with the price level, that is, the ex-ante points on the AD and SRAS curves for a given price level, represent the adjustment phase where there may be either excess aggregate demand, or excess aggregate supply. The adjustment process through the causal factors that affect aggregate demand, and those that affect aggregate supply, will move AD and SRAS to the macroequilibrium. This is the hidden or story-based adjustment in the model. So, one of the key features of this model is that you have to hypothesize, or tell the story, how the adjustment process might be working. Obviously, we cannot know for sure which of a plethora of factors might be producing that equilibrium. Nonetheless, if we know that the Fed, for example, raised or lowered interest rates during that period, then this might be one smoking gun to discuss. Or, if we know that consumers are drawing down savings to spend, then that might be another smoking gun to examine. If business inventories have been drawn down, then that might be a trigger for inventory rebuilding and an uptick in production. Clearly, in any given period there could be a host of reasons, but the macroeconomist is looking for those explanations in all of the incoming economic data. Even if you don't follow the economic data yourself, you can still be an armchair economist by reading the financial press. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Business Week, The Economist, and a host of other online financial news organizations, such as Bloomberg News, CNBC, Market Watch, Fox Business News, and so forth. Pick your favorite to follow. How long is the adjustment phase between ex-post data points? Earlier we discussed what Hicks and Keynes considered a short period of adjustment. The key point that Hicks made is that it should be short enough that no factor of production can be changed, nor expectations markedly altered. However, from a practical perspective, the adjustment phase is determined by the data frequency. If the data are quarterly, then the adjustment phase is a 3-month period. If the data are annual, then the adjustment phase is 12 months. If the data are monthly, then the adjustment phase is about 30 days. In all cases, the adjustment period represents unobserved interim changes, which are inferred by the elasticity estimates. How is long-run aggregate supply determined? We kind of mentioned this, but we need to delve into this a bit more. The last step to form the AD and AS model is to put into the graph the long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS, curve, which is a vertical line at the potential real GDP level. This should be thought of as the goal for the economy in that period. If you have had a chance to look at those real potential GDP data, you will note that the data continue to change every quarter. Why does this occur? First and foremost, that long-run aggregate supply goal is not fixed or static. The second point to know is that potential output necessarily would be changing from quarter to quarter, since the factors that drive potential output, such as labor force demographics, productivity, technology, and so forth, continue to change. Thus, one reason for the change in real potential output is simply trend growth in the economy through those supply-side factors. However, in a single and specific period in time, potential output is fixed because it is a snapshot, only to change in the next period, which is why we assume that it could be represented as a vertical line at potential output in a given quarter. Once the model is together, what is next? Pulling together the components of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model into a single graphic is only the starting point. The story told by the graphic must be interpreted. Keep in mind this model is a gap model, which means that the actual equilibrium between AD and SRAS is judged relative to its goal of LRAS. It is a simple paradigm, but holds many stories to unlock. How can recession be determined in the model? The model portrays recession based on the output or GDP gap, which measures the deviation of actual real GDP from potential real GDP, or LRAS, as a share of potential real GDP, as we learned earlier, and is calculated, as shown on this slide, as the difference between actual real GDP and real potential GDP, divided by real potential GDP, then multiplied by 100. The output gap gives us a window on inflation, based on the inflationary gap where real GDP exceeds real potential GDP, and implies a booming economy. It also gives us a window on recession, based on the recessionary output gap, where the real GDP is below real potential GDP, and represents an economy that might be in recession, an economy that might be growing, but very slowly or just moderately, or an economy that might be coming out of recession. For the U.S. economy, the average recessionary output gap between 1949 and 2020 was a negative 2.0% of real potential output, while the median recessionary output gap was a negative 1.5%. Therefore, one interpretation of large is an output gap of at least a negative 1.5%. The two largest recessionary gaps, historically, occurred in 1982, when it was minus 7.5%, and 2020, at a negative 9.2%. These quantitative benchmarks provide a way of interpreting when the U.S. economy might be in, or near recession. The graphic on this slide shows the huge output gap that marked the COVID-19 induced 2020 recession. Therefore, a rule of thumb to use for interpreting the output gap is that if it is falling and slips below minus 1.5, then historically that threshold level is consistent with a recession. This is shown on this slide. We have mentioned the inflation output gap and the recessionary output gap. But let's look at these graphically through the aggregate demand and supply model. On the left-hand side of the slide is the portrayal of the inflationary output gap. When the equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply is higher than the long-run aggregate supply, this suggests the economy is growing too rapidly, putting upward pressure on the price sector. On the right-hand side of the slide is the portrayal of the recessionary output gap. When the equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply is considerably lower than the long-run aggregate supply, this suggests the economy is growing too slowly or in recession. As just noted, the threshold for the recession is an output gap reading at or below minus 1.5. Hopefully, this shows implications from the location of the actual equilibrium versus its potential. Can actual output exceed potential? Yes, at times, as we have just seen. This can occur because potential real GDP is determined based on normal production. But there are times, for example, during wars, a national emergency, or an overheated economy, that might result in temporarily stretched production capacity. A recent example of a national emergency that may be fresh in your mind is during periods of rising COVID-19 cases during the 2020 to 2022 pandemic, when many hospitals exceeded their normal capacity by creating temporary intensive care unit, or ICU, space and extended work hours. This is a short-run situation only, and not sustainable. because it puts upward pressure on the price level. How is inflation captured in the aggregate demand and supply model? We just mentioned the inflationary output gap, but there is more insight on inflation than just that from this model. First, economists distinguish two sources of inflation. 1. Demand pull inflation, and 2. Cost push inflation. Both types of inflationary pressure are captured in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Through changes in aggregate demand, that is when AD exceeds LRAS resulting in demand pull inflation, or through short-run aggregate supply, when higher costs resulting in a leftward shift in SRAS. Let's look at these two types of inflation through this model. How is demand-induced inflation captured in the aggregate demand and supply model? On the upper portion of this slide is the portrayal of demand pull inflation through the components of the aggregate demand and supply model. Demand pull inflation can occur when there is a rightward shift in the AD curve, towards or beyond potential output, that is LRAS. Next, how is supply-induced inflation captured in the AD and AS model? On the lower portion of the slide is the portrayal of cost-push inflation through the model. Cost-push inflation can occur when there is a leftward shift in the SRAS curve, away from potential output. How is output growth captured in the model? Similar to the need to have multiple snapshots, that is, AD and AS models for multiple time periods, to infer what the inflation rate is over time. This also is true for discussing economic growth. An individual AD and AS model for a point in time portrays a static output in billions of real dollars. If you want to discuss how strong or weak real GDP growth was, that is, adding a dynamic element to your discussion, then you need to have multiple aggregate demand and supply snapshots, and determine the percentage change between those snapshots for output. Graphically, in the model this is portrayed by overlaying a second, or third or more, snapshots, which represent different time periods, and the change often is shown with arrows, or sequentially numbered subscripts to the notation, for AD or SRAS, which imply the direction of change. Although it can get messy fast, this graphic overlays two time periods on the same graphic to capture several dynamics. The quick takeaway is that between the third quarter 2020 and the economy 1 year later, we saw a sharp rightward shift in aggregate demand, but only a small shift in short-run aggregate supply, which seemingly put a greater strain on the price sector. Reaching back to the theory about the shape and elasticity of the short-run aggregate supply curve, we ask, what is the significance of the shape of the SRAS curve? The answer connects back to our earlier discussion about the elasticity of aggregate demand and supply. But this perspective combines different views into one graphic, with different implications, depending on which segment of the SRAS curve the economy is operating in. The graph on this slide shows three zones of a nonlinear short-run aggregate supply curve. They are 1. The neoclassical zone, which is relatively inelastic or vertical portion of this curve. 2. The Keynesian zone, which is the relatively elastic or flat portion of this curve, and 3. The intermediate zone, which as the name implies in between the other two. Empirically, we have noted earlier that there is more evidence for the SRAS to be characterized by the intermediate zone, given estimates of its elasticity around 1.5, which is not inelastic as the neoclassical school might argue, nor is it highly elastic as Keynes would have argued, but it tends to be within the relatively elastic range. The importance of this is whether there is a high or low degree of trade-off between wage and prices and the unemployment rate, which is the Phillips curve trade-off. In the intermediate zone of that SRAS, the Phillips curve trade-off is still viewed conceptually valid, to a slightly greater degree than in the other two zones. What is partial equilibrium analysis and how is it used with the AD and AS model? Since the reality is that aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply are changing simultaneously, macroeconomists use a microeconomics concept of partial equilibrium analysis to understand the workings of the economy and steps, holding other changes constant initially. Partial equilibrium analysis is an analytical approach that simplifies how the process of change unfolds through each factor. Although rarely thought of as a macroeconomics approach, the partial equilibrium approach is often implicitly used instructionally in macroeconomics to show specific effects on aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, or long-run aggregate supply, while ignoring other changes, including time period changes. Whether you are aware of this or not, we already have used this technique to analyze economic factors and events that cause changes in aggregate demand or supply, but we have described those changes in steps, or in isolation of all the impacts that might occur simultaneously. How is the analysis of a causal factor change in aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply traced through this model? Initially, it is important to distinguish what are the causal factors impacting the economy, and which are impacting aggregate demand, and which are impacting short-run aggregate supply, and which affect both aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. Then, identify the chain reaction, directional, and quantitative or qualitative, if possible, that each change in the causal economic factor has on AD and SRAS. This is done using partial equilibrium analysis, either graphically or using a simple flow chart. What does the term shocks mean for the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model? Economists use the term shock simply to mean exogenous changes, that is external, to the economic system. Some typical examples of demand and supply shocks are 1. Changes in OPEC oil prices. 2. Changes in tax rates. 3. Increase in the minimum wage. 4. Adverse weather impacting a broad area of the country. And 5. The COVID-19 global pandemic effect on the global supply chain and production costs. How do shocks shift short-run aggregate supply? Supply shocks, which can be beneficial or adverse, represent those changes to the determinants of the supply side or income. This would include any factor that affects real gross domestic income, which captures payments to the factors of production, that is, the sum of incomes earned and costs incurred in the production of GDP. How do shocks shift aggregate demand? Demand shocks, which can be positive or negative, represent those changes to the determinants of the demand side or expenditures. This would include any factor that affects real gross domestic product, which is the sum of expenditures by consumers, investment, government spending, and net exports. Some typical examples of demand shocks are 1. Changes in government spending or tax rates. 2. Changes in interest rates. 3. Changes in foreign exchange rates. And 4. Changes in either business or consumer expectations. Finally, keep in mind that some shocks can be both demand and supply shocks, since the shock may affect both GDP and GDI. A change in tax rates is one such example. Also, a shock may have endogenous roots, such as if business profit expectations decline because of rising wage inflation. How are recessions related to aggregate demand shocks and short-run aggregate supply shocks? An NBER study by Beckert and others characterized recessions based on whether the cause was predominantly supply-induced or demand-driven. This slide shows a summary of the type of cycle impact causing recessions between 1969 and 2020. Their study classified the 1969, 1973, and 1980 recessions as primarily supply shock-dominated business cycles. Their study classified the 1981, 2001, and 2007 recessions as primarily demand shock-dominated business cycles. The 1990 and 2020 recessions were classified as both supply and demand-impacted business cycles. Interestingly, recessions were the shortest, on average, for the dual-dominated cycles, and the longest for demand-dominated cycles. Can the AD and AS model explain a forecast? In a limited way, the answer is yes. The CBO has projections for U.S. real potential GDP. The Survey of Professional Forecasters, which is compiled by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, provides consensus forecasts for U.S. real GDP and the price level. Therefore, these components can be used to apply the model for forecast periods. How would the AD and AS model be structured based on growth rates versus gap analysis? This slide offers two perspectives. On the left side of the slide is the gap analysis models that we have been discussing, which are constructed using actual and planned data for a specific period. It is a static perspective, or snapshot at a point in time. On the other hand, academic economists have never been too happy with the price level in that gap analysis model, which led many to recast the model with the inflation rate on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. However, I have a fundamental problem relating a growth rate to a level of output, which does not make sense, even though the attempt was to make the model more realistic, which proponents of that change argued. Alternatively, some economists plot the inflation rate against the output gap, which is still problematic, in my opinion, because it is essentially a Phillips curve, since the output gap is very highly correlated with the unemployment rate. A much better alternative is to capture a growth rate dynamic in a way that is more complementary to the gap analysis model, which is portrayed on the right side of the slide. In this model, the growth rates of actual data are only used as points on the chart, compared with an estimate of potential growth and the target inflation rate between two periods. Therefore, the inflation rate is related to output growth. That is, real GDP growth. Two dotted lines are added for 1. The target inflation rate, and 2. Real potential GDP growth. In this way, there are four quadrants. Zone A, where actual inflation is above the inflation target, but output growth is below the pace of real potential output. Zone B, where actual inflation is above the inflation target, and output growth is above the pace of real potential output. Zone C, where actual inflation is below the inflation target, and output growth is below the pace of real potential output. And Zone D, where actual inflation is below the inflation target, but output growth is above the pace of real potential output. Ideally, policymakers want the economy to perform in Zone D, where inflation is below the target, but growth is above the pace of potential. Can this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model be applied internationally? Conceptually, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model has applicability around the world. However, to apply this model, which assesses the gap between actual and potential output, estimates of potential output are needed. Some countries have developed their own measure of potential output, such as the UK, but most do not. However, the World Bank developed a methodology to estimate potential output for 159 developing countries, using its production function method, and the European Union has created some studies of potential output for the European Union. Although this concludes the lecture content, we are not quite done. Initially, I will ask that you consider these thought questions. Take a moment to consider these questions. Pause the video as you do that. But before concluding this lecture, I want to go through a worked exercise to apply the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model from start to finish. Hopefully, this brings home the math of the application. However, remember that it is not the most important point to be able to draw the graph, rather to interpret it. To wrap up this discussion, let's go through all of the steps to develop the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. For this exercise, we will download data from Fred, which is shown in this slide, and develop the model for the second quarter of 2020. Note, the Fred mnemonics are shown on this slide along with the data, though I just noticed I spelled the word mnemonic incorrectly on that slide. Oops! So, we have the data needed to develop the model. And remember that real GDP ex post equals real GDI ex post, which is why we are only using real GDP for both concepts. After assembling the data, we now will go through each column of the data set. To calculate additional price points, we will simply use an arbitrary adjustment, which is 10% higher and 10% lower than the actual price level. This is shown on the slide. Next, we will use our price elasticity of demand estimate of -0.90 to calculate the planned output level, consistent with those ex ante price levels. This calculation is shown on the slide, along with the resulting data for ex ante aggregate demand. Now, we will do the same type of calculation for short-run aggregate supply, using our estimate of the price elasticity of short-run aggregate supply, which is 1.48. Those calculations are shown on this slide. Finally, the easy one is to determine the ex ante long-run aggregate supply amounts that are consistent with those ex ante price levels. This is easy because the long-run aggregate supply is assumed to be a vertical line, that is, perfectly inelastic, which means that those ex ante long-run aggregate supply points will be identical for all price observations. This is shown on the slide. With all of the data calculated, then we simply use Excel to graph those data, as demonstrated on this slide. Each line has a price and output coordinate, which is what gets plotted. Okay, simple to develop the model. Now, it is important to analyze what the model is telling us. You need to consider calculating the output gap. You need to consider the position of the equilibrium relative to the long-run aggregate supply. You may need to consider how this period compares to either the prior period or the next period. What was going on as a backdrop to this situation? This is harder work than the calculation of the model, but it is also more rewarding. With this final example, we end this lecture topic.